Night of June 5, 1944. The Normandy countryside smelled of wet earth and diesel. Rain had stopped only an hour before. South of Caen, 4 silhouettes crouched beside the skeleton of a bombed-out farmhouse. Henri Delmas, 43, former farmer and resistance fighter, checked his watch. 25 minutes remained. Luc Morel, the mechanic, André Vasseur, a university student, and Claire Lemoine, the courier, shared a look that held both fear and resolve. The rail line ran a few paces from the hedgerow. A garrison of 50 men kept the rails and the night with a confidence that smelled faintly of routine. Beyond the line, a train would pass before dawn, carrying fuel, ammunition, and men bound for the beaches. The BBC message had come like a bell through the static, the long sobs of the violins of autumn. The code meant movement, and now movement meant everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They slipped from the farmhouse like shadows. Henri felt the weight of memory and loss, days of harvest and the small grammar of domestic life that had been stripped away, yet those recollections steadied him. Luc moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had coaxed life from dead engines. His hands were steady even when his jaw clenched. André carried the satchel of explosives and walked like a student now learning bravery the hard way, raw and untested. Claire watched from the ridge with a small bulb at her hip, the light dimmed to an agreed pattern. She had delivered messages under the pretense of milking cows and sweeping floors, and had come to know the precise geometry of danger. Their plan was simple because simplicity could be obeyed in panic. 2 men would cut through to the culvert, 1 would lay charges on the southern track, and 1 would keep watch and give the signal to go. Plant, detonate, vanish. They moved with the economy of people who have learned how to minimize sound. The hedgerow was a mouth of thorns that snagged sleeves and tore at skin. Mud clung to boots like a second skin. Henri kept his father's cracked watch in a pocket close to his chest. Its steady tick was a metronome counting a tiny war. Luc knelt at the sleepers and unpacked 2 satchels crafted from scavenged munitions and stolen sugar. The latter, a domestic illicit sweetness turned into an instrument of sabotage. André's fingers shook as he fitted wires to a crude detonator. Each connection was a promise, each clip a small miracle of improvisation. Henri watched the boy and felt both the tenderness of a father and the hard edge of a commander. From the ridge, Claire flashed once, twice. The pattern was right. A dog barked somewhere to the north and was answered by silence. The garrison laughed on the far side of the line, and someone played a harmonica as if to insist that the night was ordinary. Confidence is itself camouflage. Henri felt the pressure behind his eyes like distant thunder. He tasted the damp in the air and the iron that always follows when metal meets sudden violence. Time contracted until seconds were themselves a geography of choices. Then a voice cut through the dark. Halt! Lantern beams strobed along the hedgerow, and the flare of a handheld light turned shadow into a sheet of white. The Germans moved faster than expected. Henri felt his heart as if it were a small animal thrashing in his chest, but his voice was a low blade. Now, he said. They scattered. Luc dove back when rifle fire found André's leg and dragged the boy to a shallow ditch, his movements a mixture of urgency and the muscle memory of a life spent coaxing stubborn machines. Claire stumbled down the slope, the detonator box heavy in her hands, breath sharp as a bellows. Bullets stitched the hedgerow and the air tasted like wet leaves and ozone. André hissed through clenched teeth. Leave me. Luc would not. He hauled the boy like a man who refused the arithmetic of sacrifice and clapped him into a hollow where the mud would temporarily hide them. The truck's headlights cut the field into a path of hazard. The engine's whine was a predatory voice. Henri grabbed André's shoulder and felt the warm, sticky betrayal of blood on his palm. There was no time for bargaining. Claire pressed the switch. The explosion was a book flung open. Steel screamed, and the sleepers flew in a spray of timber and rust. The rail bent like a blade and twisted into a corkscrew, as if the landscape itself had been wounded. A laden truck careened into the embankment and burst into flame, its load hissing as fuel and ammunition mixed in a small, angry inferno. The taste of copper and burnt sugar clung to their mouths, the air filled with the scent of something ancient and bitter smoke that had made and unmade 1,000 nights. For a handful of seconds the world lost at its edges and then reformed with a jagged seam along the track. When the dust settled, they crawled from the hedgerow. André lay pale beneath an oak, his fingers slack around the detonator wire. His breath was a small, stubborn thread, and his eyelids fluttered like curtains in a draught. Henri wrapped his coat about the boy and dug with fingers numb from cold and adrenaline to make a small grave. Luc pressed his palm to the fresh mound as if making a benediction without a word. Claire brushed soil over André's face as if closing a book she would never finish. There were no speeches. There was only the economy of labour and the raw, unimaginative fact of loss. By dawn, the line was broken. The train that might have carried reinforcements and precious fuel stalled in a web of wreckage several miles back. Schedules dissolved into confusion. Men on the beaches would later speak of an interlude, of hours that allowed advance and caused fewer lives to be swallowed in the surf. Henri did not hold statistics that morning. He held André's pocket watch in his palm and felt the small, absurd weight of it as if it were a confession. He carved a cross from a broken chair leg, placed it above the mound, and tucked the stopped watch into his breast pocket. It ticked no more, but its silence echoed. They hid in the woods until dusk, and then moved through fields that still smelled of cordite and wet straw. Claire hummed a nursery rhyme, the sound oddly bright against the bruised sky. It steadied her, and everyone else, because it was a remnant of a life that war had not yet fully devoured. Luc spoke of tractors and stubborn gearboxes, and the mechanical habits that had once defined him. The absurdity of such talk in the presence of loss was a gentle rebellion. Ordinary words were a way to press humanity into the seams of a world tearing at its edges. Weeks became a tangle of small operations, each one stitched with courage and marked by loss. Henri walked the rail when he could, and watched trains pass with their ordinary cargoes, men and milk and coal, unaware that iron between sleepers had once been a hinge on history. He left wildflowers on André's grave each spring, and relished the secrecy of that ritual. The blooms seemed to him to open earlier there than elsewhere, as if grief had made the earth lean forward and remember. He liked that the mound's secret belonged only to those who had been there. The land itself remembered. Hedgerows kept the memory of bullets, and the soil drank the echo of boots. Old men would point out the hollow where the culvert had been, and children would listen with mouths open to a story that was no longer news but instruction. Henri taught small things: how to read the pattern of a field for ambushes, how to tie a bootlace to keep one's foot from slipping in mud, how to listen for trains in twilight and know whether their sound carried threat or routine. Those lessons were practical and moral both. He taught his grandchildren to notice small acts, how to tie a bootlace with patience, how to listen for trains at dusk, keep a watch wound and honest. He told them that memory was a duty, that gratitude could be practiced in daily gestures, and that sometimes a single night of courage could ripple outward to save countless lives in ways names and numbers rarely measure. On an anniversary, when wheat was high and the air smelled faintly of rain, Henri walked to the oak and sat. He placed his hand on the small cross and closed his eyes. He let the long, thin litany of that night replay without dramatization, the flash of the detonator, the sudden absence of a boy's laughter, the awful quiet work of digging and burying. He breathed the smell of diesel and rain and let the memory be a quiet guest. He whispered the numbers that had once been a countdown 25 minutes and felt them ring like a bell for everything fragile and necessary. He died years later with the watch folded away beside, his things and the cross kept like a private ledger. The farmhouse roof had been mended, and laughter returned to the village in small, stubborn measures. Visitors read the plaque, and Henri's grandchildren ran barefoot across a yard that had once been a stage of fear. The wildflowers he had planted still bloomed early by that mound, a private season made of memory and debt. The war taught a man like Henri that the smallest of acts could reroute enormous engines of history. A delay of hours could spare lives on a distant shore. A single detonator could be a hinge upon which many fates turned. He had known this in the tactile way a craftsman knows a tool, not by theory, but by the callus on the hand. He carried that knowledge like a watch, measuring time as both wound and wound into futures he would never see. Those who passed the place where the rails had once lain sometimes noticed that the flowers there bloomed sooner than elsewhere. They did not ask names or dates. Some things are better kept small and private. A watch ticks on a cold night, a girl's light flashes once on a ridge, and sometimes that flash is enough to change the world for people who will never know why their morning came when it did. Night of June 5th, 1944. The orchard lay in a heavy fog that smelled of wet earth and diesel, the rain from an hour past still clinging to every leaf and branch. Henri Delmas led the small group through twisted trees, boots sinking into soft, damp soil with every careful step. His mind wandered, as it often did during these perilous missions, to his son, taken months ago and deported to Germany. 6 words, delivered over a crackling secret radio signal, had stayed with him. "Don't give up, Papa. Ever." Those words beat in rhythm with his heart as he guided Luc Morel, André Vasseur, and Claire Lemoine toward the culvert. Each step was a delicate calculation, each shadow a possible death. Luc, 32, former mechanic, knelt beside the Times culvert. He unfolded a worn canvas satchel containing explosives scavenged from German depots, combined with sugar stolen from local distilleries to create a jury-rigged charge capable of bending steel rails. The smell of cordite and syrup mixed in the damp air, pungent and oddly domestic. André, barely 20, handled the detonator wires, his hands trembling as if each tremor could unravel the entire operation. Sweat ran down his temple, dripping into the mud at his knees. He glanced at Henri, eyes wide, and Henri offered a brief, hard nod, a signal that courage was measured not by absence of fear, but by action in its presence. Claire, 24, crouched atop a ridge overlooking the line, scanning carefully. Her small flashlight, dimmed to a prearranged pattern, cut brief arcs across the field. 2 German sentries moved closer than anticipated, their boots crunching softly on gravel, rifles slung across their shoulders. A laugh echoed faintly, a man's voice confident in the night's routine, and Henri's heart skipped. Every second stretched into eternity, the world reduced to breaths, shadows, and the faint pulse of distant engines. Time itself seemed compressed into this critical junction, where hesitation meant death and courage meant everything. Henri's voice cut through the tension. Now! It was a single word, a blade slicing through fog and fear. Luc's hands moved with mechanical certainty, pressing the detonator. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and a thunderclap of fire and steel erupted across the culvert. The rails twisted violently, metal shrieking in protest as the train barreled toward its doomed path. Sparks flew, and fire engulfed a German truck swerving into the embankment. Flames licked at its tires, and the acrid smell of burning diesel filled the air. Henri shoved André and Luc into the nearest cover, his body tense, muscles coiled against the onslaught of noise, heat, and flying debris. Claire stumbled down the slope, clutching the detonator box, heart hammering, mud caking her sleeves. For 12 hours, the first waves of reinforcements bound for the beaches were halted. The sound of alarms, shouts, and hurried commands carried across the fields, but the small four had vanished into the night. Henri's mind flickered to André, pale beneath an oak, life bleeding away despite their efforts. The boy's fingers were curled tightly around a detonator wire, almost as if holding on to the mission itself. Henri dug frantically with hands now slick with mud and blood, carving a shallow grave beneath the oak. He marked it with a crude wooden cross, nothing ornate, but sufficient to hold memory in the earth. 25 minutes had changed the course of history. Henri's thoughts returned to his son again, imagining him somewhere in Germany, unaware that his father's actions had bought hours of life for hundreds of soldiers landing on the beaches. The sound of distant artillery echoed faintly from the coast, a reminder of the invasion that had begun with the sunrise. Claire remained near, eyes scanning for lingering threats, breath coming in harsh, uneven pulls. Luc's hands were blackened with soot and blood, his jacket torn where shrapnel had grazed him. Henri felt the weight of responsibility for all of them pressing down like the sodden earth above the culvert. The woods offered cover, but every rustle of leaves could be a German patrol. Henri moved cautiously, dragging André's body toward the small trench they had used for concealment. Luc supported him, muttering under his breath words of encouragement as though the motion itself could reverse fate. Claire stayed alert, listening to the wind, interpreting the pattern of distant sounds, the whisper of night birds, and the faint crackle of radio chatter across the forest. Each sensory cue became vital intelligence, a way to cheat the lethal mathematics of enemy patrols. Once the immediate danger had passed, Henri paused beneath the canopy of oaks and beech, mud streaked across his face and hands, body aching from exertion and tension. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, filling his lungs with the wet, earthy scent of Normandy at night. He closed his eyes and imagined André alive, imagined the detonator wires never trembling, the train never halted, and the beaches swarming with men who might not have survived without this small act of destruction. He thought of the long sobs of violins carried in a message from the BBC, the eerie coded poetry of war that had guided them to this night. By dawn, the world seemed to have returned to a fragile calm. Mist hovered over fields still blackened by fire, the twisted rails a jagged scar through the landscape. Henri, Luc, and Claire remained hidden in the undergrowth, watching the sunrise bleed across the horizon, its pale light revealing the devastation they had wrought. Smoke curled in slow ribbons above the culvert, and the acrid odour of gunpowder lingered in the air. It was quiet now, but the silence carried a weight heavier than the explosion itself. Henri thought again of André, buried beneath the oak with only the crude cross to mark him. The boy's courage had been absolute, unflinching, and Henri's own actions had been a measure of their combined defiance. He pressed his hand to the wooden marker, mud cooling against his skin, and whispered a prayer for a boy he could never save and for soldiers who had not yet landed on the beaches. The watch in his breast pocket ticked silently, a mechanical heartbeat keeping time with the memory of what had passed. The operation had been small in scale but immense in consequence. A single train delayed, a single road blocked, and the gears of invasion shifted imperceptibly, buying precious hours of life. Henri understood the mathematics of war differently now, not by the ratio of enemy to ally, but by moments, by the courage measured in seconds, by the cost of each human, a life weighed against the urgency of the mission. He had learned that a boy's trembling hands could alter history, and that a whistle in the night could ripple outward to change thousands of fates. In the following days, Henri, Luc, and Claire moved quietly through the Normandy countryside, avoiding patrols and hiding in the abandoned ruins of villages. They witnessed the creeping movement of armoured vehicles, the occasional firefight between scouting parties, and the tense moments when the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, from the distant hum of engines to the soft rustle of leaves, was a signal, and they had learned to interpret them all. Henri's mind remained partly on André, partly on the beaches, and partly on the fragile network of resistance fighters scattered across the region. As the sun rose higher on the third day after the explosion, Henri allowed himself a rare thought, that in these small acts of sabotage there was a form of poetry. Each wire laid, each explosive placed, was a stanza, each delayed train, a line of verse written in fire and steel. The land itself held the memory, in twisted metal, scorched earth, and the subtle, enduring scent of gunpowder mingled with rain-soaked soil. Henri recognized that their names might never appear in history books, but that did not diminish the act itself. History is measured not only in ink but in consequence, in the silent testimony of those whose courage alters events unseen. Claire, ever vigilant, kept the detonator box close, a relic of that night, and often traced her fingers along its edges, as if remembering the cold metal, the smell of wet earth, and the weight of the responsibility they had carried. Luc spoke little, tending to wounds and whispering mechanical observations, as if grounding himself in craft could steady the soul. Henri moved like a shadow among them, thinking in terms of time, distance, and human lives, calculating risk as he had never before, and understanding that in war, morality and duty were entangled with improvisation, chance, and relentless courage. When night fell again, they returned to the farmhouse, now partially rebuilt by villagers unaware of the horrors that had transpired. Henri lit a small lamp, the glow flickering across mud-streaked faces. They shared a quiet meal of bread, cheese, and cold meat, ordinary sustenance in an extraordinary moment. Conversation was sparse. Eyes met across the table, and in them was the understanding that every word spared, every breath taken without notice, was victory in its own way. Each of them bore scars invisible to the world but palpable to themselves. Days later, Henri returned to the oak where André was buried. The mound was small, wild flowers beginning to sprout along its edge. He knelt, brushing away damp leaves, and spoke quietly into the wind. The story of a boy whose courage had measured time itself, whose actions had prevented countless deaths, and whose absence was a wound healed only by memory. The forest responded with quiet, leaves rustling, a distant bird calling, and the soft, persistent echo of a wind that had passed through battles, fields, and lives, carrying with it the weight of all that had been done and all that remained. As the invasion progressed, the impact of their sabotage became apparent. Allied forces advanced more swiftly than anticipated, German reinforcements delayed by the twisted rails and destroyed trucks. Henri, Luc, and Claire observed the distant movement of troops and armour, understanding that their act had created a ripple through the theatre of war. Each delayed convoy, each missed opportunity for the enemy, was a testament to the strategic value of precision, courage, and the human element in warfare. Months later, when peace had settled unevenly across France, Henri returned to the site once more. He traced his fingers over the crude wooden cross, now weathered and grey, feeling the persistence of memory in the rough wood. Wildflowers bloomed, the train line repaired, and the landscape had begun to forget its scars. Yet Henri remembered every detail, André's fingers curling around the detonator wire, Claire's eyes wide with tension, Luc's mechanical hands steady amidst chaos. He understood, in a profound way, that bravery is measured not in medals or recognition, but in the silent, precise acts that change lives in imperceptible ways. The orchard, the culvert, the tracks, all became monuments of the uncelebrated courage of ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. Henri's thoughts drifted between past and present, recalling a boy's final struggle and the mission that had altered the course of the D-Day landings. The memory was alive in the very soil, in the twisting of rails that no longer existed, and in the wind that carried faint echoes of explosions long past. He realized that history is often recorded in grand strategies, yet its most profound turns hinge on moments, measured in seconds, decisions made in whispers, and the unyielding resolve of the human heart. Henri's final reflection in the orchard was simple. The world moves on, but acts of courage linger, unseen but enduring. 25 minutes, a boy, a satchel of explosives, and 4 determined souls had intersected to buy hours that saved hundreds of lives. André's name, the crude cross, the twisted rails, and the memory of that night became a quiet testament. Henri understood that although the world might forget the particulars, the consequences remained an indelible mark of courage that, like the wildflowers blooming on the mound, returned each spring to remind the living of those who had given everything. The small group dispersed into the countryside in the early morning haze, each carrying the weight of memory, responsibility, and the faint, unshakable knowledge that their actions, however private, had shaped the fate of men who would never know their names. Henri kept André's watch close, a reminder that seconds could alter history, that courage is often measured in time and consequence, and that the quiet acts of ordinary people can resound through events of extraordinary magnitude. Wildflowers blossomed earlier at the mound each spring, perhaps from the soil's memory, perhaps as a subtle acknowledgement of sacrifice. Henri watched them, feeling the pulse of life and history intertwined. He understood that the war's enormity is reflected not only in battles and strategies, but in the delicate geometry of human choices, in the courage of those who confront fear directly, and in the acts that, while unseen by most, ripple outward to change countless lives forever. Henri's final days were spent imparting these lessons quietly to those who would listen. How to read fields and forests for threats, how to tie knots that would not fail, how to understand time and chance as allies in the preservation of life. Memory became pedagogy, and the orchard, the oak, and the hidden culvert became classrooms where courage was measured not in glory, but in survival, consequence, and the persistence of humanity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time the war had ended, Henri had survived, as had Luc and Claire, each carrying the ghosts of that night. They rarely spoke of it. The act was too raw, too precise, too permanent in its consequences. Yet, in quiet moments, Henri would return to the mound beneath the oak and remember André's courage, the thunder of twisted steel, the acrid smell of fire and diesel, and the 25 minutes that had altered history. And in those moments he smiled faintly, knowing that in the calculus of war, the smallest acts of bravery often carried the greatest weight. In the decades that followed, Henri visited the site often. The world above changed villages, rebuilt, roads paved, trains running with cargo of commerce instead of war, but the memory persisted beneath the soil. He traced his fingers along the cross, feeling the rough, weathered wood, and reflected on the extraordinary intersection of chance, courage, and consequence. Each visit was a meditation on the magnitude of small acts, the quiet heroism of youth, and the inexorable truth that in war, as in life, minutes and decisions can echo far beyond their immediate measure. The orchard and the culvert remained silent witnesses, but Henri knew their lessons endured. The winds of Normandy carried with them whispers of that night, the explosion, the fallen boy, the fire on the rails, and the delicate balance between life and death. And in that silence, Henri found a kind of peace, knowing that the courage and sacrifice of 4 individuals had shaped the destiny of many, leaving a hidden yet indelible imprint upon history itself. This was the cost and the currency of war: seconds bought with courage, lives saved through risk, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the unseen actions of a few could ripple across the course of events in ways grand strategies never could. 25 minutes, 4 souls, and a single act of sabotage had altered the lives of hundreds of men landing on the beaches, a truth that Henri carried in his heart until his final days. The oak, the wildflowers, the cross, and the soil remained, a testament to human courage and the enduring power of memory. Henri's story, though uncelebrated in history books, lived on in these quiet, living monuments. And for anyone who walked through the orchard, unaware of the night when history had bent beneath human hands, the wildflowers told a story of bravery, sacrifice, and the profound consequences of acts done in the shadows. Henri often thought of André in those quiet hours, imagining the boy's smile, his courage, and the weight he had carried without complaint. The war had taken so much, yet in that, a loss, it had also revealed the extraordinary capacity for courage and love that ordinary humans could summon. And Henri, now an old man, understood that the memory of 25 minutes, of a detonator pressed in mud and rain, and of a boy's hands trembling yet unyielding, was more enduring than any report, medal, or history book could ever convey. In the final reckoning, Henri's legacy was not written in public acclaim or trophies of war, but in the lives preserved, the moments altered, and the silent testimony of the earth itself. 25 minutes had saved countless men. 25 minutes had defined courage. 25 minutes had transformed grief into purpose. And Henri knew, with a quiet certainty, that this was the true measure of their mission, a truth that would outlast the years and endure long after the guns had fallen silent. Wildflowers continued to bloom early. The wind whispered through the orchard, and Henri smiled, imagining the boy's words echoing, across time, "Don't give up, Papa. Ever." And in that whisper, the night, the explosion, the courage, and the sacrifice converged, immortalized in memory, soil, and the quiet rhythm of human resolve. By mid-June 1944, the battlefield in Normandy had become a deadly chessboard. Allied tankers advanced cautiously, aware that German armor, Panthers and Tigers, dominated the hedgerows and open fields. The standard M4 Sherman, equipped with a 75mm gun, was increasingly outclassed. At ranges exceeding 500 meters, the Sherman could barely scratch a Panther's sloped armor and had little hope against a Tiger's 80mm frontal plates. Every advance carried enormous risk. Crews gripped their controls tightly, hearts hammering, as the distant silhouettes of enemy tanks loomed like predators waiting to strike. On June 13th, 8 kilometers south of Carentan, Oberleutnant Hinrich Bäumer peered through the periscope of his Panther. Below him, 3 Panthers lay hull down in the folds of the hedgerows, their 75mm guns trained on the approaching Shermans. Bäumer's lips curved faintly. He had faced these American tanks before and understood their limitations. The enemy would be forced to close dangerously to have any chance of impact. Each meter they gained was a calculated risk, a step toward potential destruction. The Shermans rolled forward, engines whining in the humid morning air, crews exposed and unaware of the waiting threat. Bäumer's gunner, Unteroffizier Hoffmann, tracked the lead Sherman and reported, 800 meters, sir. AP rounds loaded. Fire. The Sherman's hull shuddered violently, smoke and flames erupting from the hatches. Within seconds, the tank was consumed, a pillar of fire illuminating the green hedgerow in stark contrast. Bäumer allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction, knowing his crew's precision and discipline had exacted a heavy toll. Yet, even as destruction unfolded on the battlefield, Allied workshops across England were not idle. Engineers and ordnance specialists laboured tirelessly, designing longer-barrelled guns, higher-velocity rounds, and HVAP projectiles capable of piercing Tiger armour. They studied weaknesses, armour angles, and ballistic calculations, preparing Shermans that could, in time, meet the German predators on more equal terms. The battle south of Carentan was grim, but it also underscored the relentless innovation driving the war. Steel met fire, tactics met courage, and every loss sowed the seed for a future advantage, a new hope in the fight for Normandy. This was war at its most calculated and deadly, a duel of armour, firepower, and human nerve, where every second could determine life or death, and every technological advance could shift the balance in favour of those bold enough to endure the crosshairs. By late June 1944, the battlefield in Normandy had shifted in unexpected ways. The HVAP high-velocity armour-piercing rounds remained controversial among Allied command. They relied on scarce tungsten cores, tightly rationed for strategic priorities, and generals feared wasting such precious material. Yet on the front lines, desperate tank crews understood the brutal calculus. Their M4 Shermans could not survive against Tigers without them. Reluctantly, commanders authorized limited deployment. Crews quickly retrofitted their Shermans with the 76mm gun, capable of firing HVAP rounds at muzzle velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second. What had seemed impossible, the ability to pierce the legendary Tiger's frontal armor, was suddenly achievable. The first engagements were careful, almost experimental. Tankers learned to exploit every advantage: hull-down positions, sunken lanes, and terrain that limited German visibility. One battle near Saint-Lô demonstrated HVAP's devastating power. A Sherman company occupied a narrow, sunken lane, concealed from distant observation. Tigers advanced in confidence, their crews expecting the usual attrition of Shermans, easy targets at range. At 700 meters, the first HVAP rounds found their marks. Thick 80mm frontal plates offered little resistance. The explosions tore through armor with brutal precision. The German crews scrambled, abandoning their tanks as smoke and fire consumed their once imposing machines. Word of these successes spread quickly through the Allied units. The HVAP round transformed tactics. No longer did tankers rely solely on maneuver, flanking, or overwhelming numbers. With this weapon, Disciplined gunners could neutralize a Tiger's advantage at distance, reshaping engagements that had once been hopeless. Over the next 3 weeks, Allied tankers destroyed more than 80 Tigers across Normandy, each kill a testament to courage, training, and the lethal precision of the new ammunition. Despite the clear tactical advantage, the weapon remained rationed, its scarcity a constant reminder of the balance between innovation and logistics. Every round fired carried strategic weight, every decision could not be reversed. Tankers adapted, learning to measure angles, calculate distances, and control recoil to maximize the HVAP's effectiveness. They understood that each engagement was not just a battle, but a test of ingenuity and nerve. The Shermans were still lightly armored, vulnerable to nearly every other German gun, yet in the hands of determined crews armed with HVAP, they became hunters of monsters. What had once been a hopeless struggle, Shermans versus Tigers, was now a contest of skill and precision, a deadly dance in the hedgerows where courage and technology intersected with lethal consequences. Victory remained uncertain, but the scales had begun to tip. By the last week of June, 1944, the Normandy hedgerows were no longer the exclusive hunting grounds of German armour. The introduction of HVAP high-velocity armour-piercing rounds had transformed the Allied approach to armoured warfare, turning fear into calculated opportunity. Crews now understood that brute force alone would not win the day. Precision, patience, and terrain mastery were just as important. Each Sherman, once considered inferior, became a platform for innovation and tactical ingenuity. Crews studied the lay of the land, learning to use every ditch, sunken lane, and hedgerow to their advantage. Hills provided cover for ambushes, cornfields concealed movement. Every angle, every approach, was measured against the vulnerabilities of the German Tiger. Engineers had worked tirelessly behind the front lines, their workshops echoing with the hiss of welding torches and the metallic clang of armor plates being shaped and bolted onto Sherman hulls. Tanks were modified to accommodate the 76mm gun that fired HVAP rounds at muzzle velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second. The tungsten cores, rare and valuable, were rationed carefully, ensuring that each shot counted. Crew training emphasized not only marksmanship but understanding the physics of penetration. Velocity, range, and armor slope dictated the outcome of each engagement. Tankers practiced with mock targets, simulating Tiger hulls, learning to strike weak points while remaining concealed. In Normandy, where visibility was often limited and enemy observation keen, these skills made the difference between life and fiery destruction. Meanwhile, German tankers like Oberleutnant Heinrich Bäumer began to notice subtle, unsettling changes. Initially, the Americans were easy to dismiss their Shermans outgunned, outarmored, and predictable. But in June, reports came back of Tigers burning, hulls penetrated, crews fleeing in panic. Bäumer's confidence eroded with every encounter. Where once he had stalked Sherman formations with disdain, now he approached cautiously, calculating distances and anticipating ambushes. His gunners, trained to expect inferiority, found themselves reacting to precise shots that could defeat 80mm frontal armor from 700 meters. Tigers no longer dominated the field with impunity. They became vulnerable to patience, strategy, and technological innovation that leveraged the smallest opening to devastating effect. Allied tankers rapidly adapted. Squads coordinated ambushes, with one tank drawing attention while another, positioned at an optimal angle, fired HVAP rounds into the Tiger's exposed flank or lower glacis. Surprise multiplied lethality. Mobility and communication became paramount. The Sherman's comparatively lighter armor allowed for rapid repositioning. The battlefield became a dynamic network of interlocking fire zones. In one engagement near Saint-Lô, a platoon of 8 Shermans took position in a sunken lane, waiting for 4 Tigers to advance confidently. At 700 meters, HVAP rounds tore through, their frontal armor with terrifying precision. Smoke curled upward as crews abandoned tanks, panic replacing the methodical confidence that had carried them for so long. The engagement lasted minutes, but the psychological impact rippled through German ranks for days. Within the same week, Allied units replicated these successes across multiple sectors. Shermans, guided by terrain, intelligence, and precise firepower, penetrated Tiger armor in over a dozen engagements. Each victory reinforced lessons: know the land, respect the enemy, exploit angles, and trust in technology and training. The banned HVAP rounds, once limited and controversial, were now essential. Commanders adjusted tactics, emphasizing their careful distribution, while crews trained to maximize every shot. Ammunition became both a tactical and psychological instrument. Tankers felt empowered, their confidence buoyed by repeated successes and the realization that they could, in fact, neutralize the battlefield's most fearsome weapons. The Germans, forced to reassess, shifted tactics. Bäumer's Panther platoons began to operate more defensively. Hedgerows now observed with caution. Patrols were slower, formations tighter, and flanking maneuvers calculated with greater care. The arrogance that had characterized German armored doctrine in early June gave way to measured caution, a subtle but profound shift in the dynamic of combat. Allied tankers seized the initiative, striking first and with precision. Their attacks combined surprise, coordination, and lethal firepower, making the enemy react rather than dictate. In the open fields and narrow lanes of Normandy, the psychological and tactical balance had begun to shift. The once dominant Tigers, symbols of invincibility, now faced a persistent, cunning adversary. Shermans, previously derided and underestimated, had become instruments of transformation. The introduction of HVAP rounds had leveled the technological disparity, and the ingenuity of crews and engineers ensured that this advantage was leveraged fully. Each engagement reinforced a simple truth: courage and adaptability, paired with innovation, could overcome even the most formidable enemy. By the end of June, Allied tankers were no longer merely surviving. They were dictating the terms of engagement. Where once fear had dictated tactics, now initiative and precision ruled. Shermans moved deliberately, exploiting terrain, coordinating fire, and striking with deadly efficiency. In a single week, the cumulative impact of these tactics and technologies became apparent. German confidence wavered, casualties mounted, and Allied forces gained momentum that would carry through the summer campaign. The battlefield, once dominated by the mythic power of German tanks, had been transformed. The previously banned HVAP rounds were no longer an experimental weapon. They were a force multiplier, enabling ordinary Shermans to perform extraordinary feats. This tactical revolution was not solely the result of firepower. It was a combination of ingenuity, observation, and adaptability. Crews learned to read the battlefield, anticipate enemy movements, and exploit the weaknesses of even the most heavily armored Tiger. Engineers continued to innovate, finding ways to strengthen armor, improve gun accuracy, and enhance mobility. Communication between units became crucial. Signalers, spotters, and radio operators ensured that every ambush and engagement was coordinated, minimizing unnecessary risk and maximizing effectiveness. The Shermans' relative agility allowed them to reposition quickly after firing, striking fear into crews unaccustomed to being hunted rather than the hunters. In practical terms, the effect was devastating. In hedgerows around Carentan, Saint-Lô, and the fields south of Caen, German armor suffered repeated losses. Panthers and Tigers, once thought invincible, were now felled by disciplined crews wielding HVAP-equipped Shermans. Morale among Allied tankers surged, confidence replacing the dread that had once accompanied every sortie. Each Tiger destroyed or disabled reinforced the lesson: no weapon, no matter how formidable, is invulnerable to innovation, courage, and precise execution. By the close of the month, Allied forces could approach previously contested sectors with a new tactical understanding. The Shermans, armed with HVAP, had shifted from defensive, survival-focused operations to proactive, decisive action. The battlefield, once defined by the dominance of German heavy tanks, had become a dynamic environment where initiative, firepower, and ingenuity determined outcomes. Strategic momentum was now in Allied hands, and the lessons learned in Normandy would inform operations throughout the remainder of the European campaign. The use of HVAP, combined with terrain mastery and crew training, had fundamentally altered armoured warfare. Previously banned and rationed, the rounds became essential tools of survival and victory. Allied tankers had proven that determination, coordination, and innovation could overcome technological superiority. The once dominant Tigers no longer ruled the hedgerows unchallenged. Instead, the Shermans, transformed by engineering and tactical adaptation, had turned the tide of battle, demonstrating that courage, skill, and ingenuity could reshape the course of war itself. Henri Delmas returned to Normandy decades after the guns had fallen silent, the land now draped in wildflowers and sunlight, a stark contrast to the mud, smoke, and fire he had once known. The tracks had been rebuilt, trains once again carrying goods rather than reinforcements and munitions. Yet every clatter over the rails reminded him of the nights when the rail lines had meant life or death. The plaques honouring resistance fighters dotted the countryside, yet very few commemorated the tankers who had fought unseen, who faced the overwhelming might of tigers and panthers and survived by ingenuity, teamwork, and sheer resolve. The Shermans, once dismissed as inferior, had become symbols of courage, innovation, and tactical adaptability. Henri remembered the first deployment of HVAP high-velocity armour-piercing rounds and how their tungsten cores, once scarce and rationed, had allowed a small number of Shermans to strike decisive blows against German armour. 80 Tigers had fallen in less than 3 weeks, their crews learning a painful lesson. Mass-produced firepower was meaningless without strategy, precision, and the ability to exploit terrain. The sound of a tank firing, a memory ingrained in Henri's mind, had shifted from terror to pride over time, representing not only destruction but survival and mastery of an impossible battlefield. As he walked past hedgerows that had once concealed ambushes, Henri thought of Luc Morel, his steadfast companion, whose mechanical skill had been essential in jury-rigging explosives and ensuring that every Sherman and improvised device functioned under extreme stress. He recalled André Vasseur, the young university student who had given everything, his life sacrificed beneath the oak tree Henri had marked with a crude cross, a reminder of the stakes in the fight for freedom. Claire Lemoine's courage as a courier, navigating deadly terrain to deliver information and keep watch over operations, remained vivid in Henri's memory. Each of their actions, intertwined with the deployment of HVAP rounds and tactical innovation, had altered the course of the Normandy campaign. Without them, the course of history might have been tragically different. Henri's mind lingered on the countless decisions made in split seconds, the calculated risks, and the heavy responsibility of guiding men through peril. Every action, every move in the shadows of hedgerows and sunken lanes, had contributed to turning the tide of armoured warfare. The fields of Normandy, where Sherman tracks, once clattered and tigers burned, now held only the quiet rustle of grass and distant birdsong. Henri remembered the first time HVAP rounds had been fired in anger. The 76mm guns, retrofitted into Shermans, had allowed tungsten cores to pierce 80mm frontal armour at distances over 700 metres. The German crews had been shocked, unprepared for precision attacks that leveraged angles and terrain. Tigers that had once stalked the hedgerows with impunity now burned under the meticulous planning and execution of Allied tankers. The once mocked Shermans became deadly instruments when paired with training, innovation, and tactical insight. Henri recalled how engineers had welded additional armour, improved mobility, and trained crews to maximize effectiveness under extreme conditions. Each success reinforced a vital lesson. Courage, preparation, and strategic adaptation could overcome even the most formidable enemy. Normandy, in its current tranquility, bore silent testimony to the evolution of warfare, where once seemingly inferior machines had rewritten the rules. Walking through the reconstructed villages and across former battlegrounds, Henri could almost hear the echoes of the past, the roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, the screams of men and tanks alike. The smell of burning fuel and gunpowder, which had once dominated the air, now existed only in memory. Veterans like Henri and Luc had survived not only because of firepower, but because of ingenuity, quick thinking, and unyielding courage. The fight had been more than a clash of steel and weapons. It had been a test of will, skill, and human endurance. Strategic choices, such as positioning Shermans to exploit weak points in tiger armor and coordinating ambushes with precision, had become decisive. The HVAP rounds, once controversial and rationed, were now legendary, their effects felt in every successful engagement and in the recalibration of German tactics. Henri paused, near a small memorial, noting the quiet salute of younger visitors who might never grasp the full magnitude of what had occurred there. The war had moved on, the world had moved on, yet for those who had survived, the memory of courage under fire remained vivid. 25 minutes, a weapon once banned, and the calculated bravery of men facing impossible odds had altered history. The Normandy campaign had not only been a test of military technology, but a crucible in which human resilience, ingenuity, and strategy had emerged victorious. The legacy of fire left behind by Shermans and their crews was etched not only in the scars of the battlefield, but in the lessons of adaptation and courage that would resonate for generations. Across the rolling fields where smoke and blood had once mingled, Henri thought of the future and the stories that would be told. Plaques commemorated heroes, but the true narrative was woven through the memories of those who had fought, those who had fallen, and those who had lived to witness the aftermath. Survivors like Henri and Luc carried the quiet knowledge of what had been accomplished, the Sherman's journey from ridicule to legend, the tactical ingenuity of HVAP rounds, and the unwavering courage that had allowed ordinary men to confront overwhelming odds and prevail. Walking beneath the sun rising over Normandy, Henri felt a profound sense of closure. For him, the fight had always been about more than machinery or strategy. It had been about survival, honor, and the preservation of freedom. The fields no longer burned, the tanks no longer roared, yet the legacy endured. In every whispered remembrance, in every veteran's salute, and in the stories passed to new generations, the lessons of courage, adaptation, and tactical brilliance persisted. 25 minutes of decisive action, a weapon once restricted, and the courage of men had left an indelible mark on history, transforming fear into legend and teaching that even in the darkest hours, ingenuity and bravery could prevail against the mightiest of foes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.